Today, we're going to discuss one of the package deals. And while life was still going on as normal, some of the meetups that Razi was running had as their theme various package deals. And today's package deal is the notion of profiteering. And we usually hear this term. It's never really defined. So if you see the definition, it says something like profit which is unjust, which is funny because for Marxists, for example, all profits are in a way unjust. But we hear the term profiteering usually during a crisis. And it usually has to do with scarce stuff, with the prices going up. And usually there are calls, even by liberal governments and intellectuals, for some control on the prices of important stuff that we need during a crisis. And we're going to discuss this with two guests. We have Robert von Dortmund. Robert is a man of the market, but also someone with intellectual interest. He's a student of objectivism. He has been active in the objectivist, let's say, movement in Europe, and he's coaching startup companies, and he has many years experience with Egon Zehnder International, training and executives, if I understand well, and kind of being someone who is in the market and can give us. So he's the bad guy in the narrative. He's probably one of the profiteers. And our second guest is someone who is an intellectual accomplice of the profiteers. It's Andrew Bernstein, a philosopher, a professor, and an author. I encourage people to read this book when they feel down. I read this at the beginning of the pandemic when the narrative was that this is going to be, I don't know, something between the end of times or who knows what, and it definitely cheered me up. So without further delay, Robert, the stage is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Nikos, and thank you, Razi, for having me on. It's my first time. Actually, we had planned to come to, or I had planned to come to Oxford and to Cambridge, or what was it, and London to do the roadshow, be on the panel, which would have been nice. I could have seen and meet you guys live rather than on this screen. So thank you for that. And yeah, it's these are difficult times for a lot of people. We talked about the economy just briefly before, and hopefully we can touch upon a number of these things in the Q&A. Razi, is that or Nikos? I think that's all right. We can do that. If there are questions around that. But on the issue of profiteering, I think it is a strange word, and it comes up in times of crisis more than other times. I understand that in the UK there is a special committee now being activated to clamp down on people that make unreasonable profits on certain things like masks and whatever, hand disinfections and things like that. Whenever I read the word profiteering and unjust, I have no idea. I get nervous, but I have no idea what they actually mean. It means that they can at will, do whatever they want to do, and that is, I think, the underlying idea is that they want to put the word profit and the profit motive in a negative connotation. Because it's selfish, because it's associated with capitalism one way or another, and capitalism, of course, is also a negative thing to a lot of these the people that will use those terms. Profit, economics 1.0. Profit is a good thing. Profit is simply the difference between what you get for a product or service and the amount of money it did cost you to produce it. And if you make a profit, it means you create value. When I speak with my startups, it's always about creating value. Without creating value, there's no existence. So you have to create value, and hence you have to make a profit, which is something good. And certainly in times of a crisis as well. I mean, look at it. There's a shortage of masks, or there's a shortage of ventilators, or there's a shortage of a virus medication, or there's a shortage about testing, which is very, very serious. If you then start talking about, the people who make these things, potentially, because there was a shortage, they are bad and they are not allowed to make a profit, then the one thing will happen is there will not be enough produced. Profit is an incentive to produce these things. So what you should have done is say, hey, we want you to make, to develop tests, to produce them, and we will pay you for it. We will buy them, we will pay you for it. Let the profit motive work so that there's more people involved to do it, and there will be more supply, which will bring, by the way, prices down in the longer term as well. One of the bad industries has always been the pharmaceutical industry, and that is the industry that we are now depending on for medication and for medicines. And there's a long article in the Dutch leading newspaper saying that government even more has to control the pharmaceutical industry. I wrote a piece in the newspaper. They treat that kind of industry as if it was a tree that is growing autonomously out of its own without asking why or how or whatever. And then the fruits that are on the tree are somehow belong to all of us. Well, if you want to stop those trees growing, that is exactly what you have to do. You make sure that you control it, and slowly they will stop. But that's economics 1.0 and not politics 1.0. But I think overall, then the last word is that profiteering, I think it's just an attempt to put over people's head that profit as such is bad, and working for yourself and making a profit is not a good idea. I think that is behind it. And I don't know whether it works, but probably does.
Yeah, and I agree with what you said, Robert. It would be definitely worth it in the Q&A for people, if they want to ask questions that are beyond the narrow space of profiteering, because since we have you here, it would be good to benefit from your takes on the current situation and what's going to happen with the economy or what is already happening. Thank you. Andy, give us your opening thoughts.
First of all, I think the term profiteer is a leftist term. It's a Marxist term. It's like robber barons or the Gilded Age or corporate raiders. It has a built-in negative kind of connotation, and as such, I think it should just be dismissed. Just like robber barons. But I think if the term has any rational meaning, it would be. Robert made a good point, making a unreasonable profit, unjust profit. Well, unreasonable or unjust by what standard? It's mushy, it's rubber-headed. There's no way to rigorously define that. If it has any rational meaning, I think it would be making a profit on immoral activities or unjust activities. For example, you guys have all seen Schindler's List, right? Well, Oskar Schindler originally was making a lot of money on slave labor. Now that's profiteering in a rational sense. And one of the great things in that movie, it's just horrible. It really shows the truth about the Holocaust. But one of the great things about the movie is how Oskar Schindler rises from this guy who's making money on slave labor, profiteering, to a real hero who's standing up for innocent lives against brutal totalitarianism. So other than that, where you're a hitman and you're making money on killing people. If you're making money on unjust, immoral activities, then I think you could say that's profiteering. But in a free market where people are exchanging values voluntarily, I would dismiss the term. It's a Marxist term. It's a loaded term. It's an attempt to smuggle anti-capitalism in via means of this, of this term. So I'm a philosopher. I'm not an economist. I'm not a businessman like Robert. So I just look at it from the moral sense. First of all, I remember in times of drought, sometimes somebody who's got access to bottled water, can bring the water into the drought area and charge high prices for it, because water was in demand. Well, first of all, if I have, or anybody has a truck filled with Poland Spring, or whatever, it's my property. I could do what I want with it. I could drink it. I could, save it for my family. I could give it away. I could sell it at $1 a bottle. I could sell it for whatever price I could get for the bottle. It's my property. Morally, it's absolutely my right to do what I want with my property. And that has to be stated. The right to private property is sacred here. And it has to be stated, it has to be upheld, it has to be respected, it has to be protected. So my moral right, or person X's moral right, to do whatever he wants with that property, including sell it for $100 a bottle if he wants. Now, notice one of the most beautiful principles in the objectivist ethics is that the moral is the practical. That acting morally and protecting somebody's right to act morally leads to beneficent practical results. In the case of the water example, since it's your right to charge $100 a bottle or whatever you want, for the water, since it's yours, the high price, like Robert was saying, the high price is part of the profit motive. It attracts that value, it attracts that commodity into the drought-ridden area. Entrepreneurs now can make money by bringing water, into that area. And so you see the beneficent practical results where there was previously a shortage of water. Now there's going to be much more water available. And of course, with the supply increasing relative to demand, the price comes back down. So the moral is the practical, and making money in times of an emergency, whether it's a drought or it's a pandemic or whatever it is, making money by supplying a product that's in demand is a noble, virtuous, highly moral activity, and has extremely beneficent results from it. So that's what I have to say on this.
All right, I want to push both of you a bit more. So at least in Greece, when we say profiteering, the number one example that comes to mind were some people that during the Great Hunger, during the Nazi occupation in the winter, I think of 42, when people were literally dying on the streets, literally. So every day you'd have the bin collectors, instead of collecting like rubbish, they were literally collecting dead bodies. And during that time, you had people who would sell like a bottle of oil or a loaf of bread for prices that, according to urban legend, would be like, you sell your house or you sell something like that, literally for a loaf of bread. So, and usually they will use these kind of examples. Or these days, you mentioned drugs, Robert. So they will say, look, if my life depends on that drug, why should you make a profit out of it? Or why should that profit be high? I need the drug. And there seems to be this so-called social contract that says that we all in this together. So why should you make a profit when my life depends on it? That's what the devil's advocate would say. So how would you react to these narratives?
I think it boils, you hear this all the time, by the way, and the water example of Andy was quite nice. I sometimes ask people, there's this guy is really drowning, very similar to what happens in Greece. There's somebody come to your door and he needs a drop of water, otherwise he will die. Whether it's a good or a bad thing that you give it to him is maybe something else, whether you would, whether that's moral for you to do or not, or whatever. But the big question is, if you don't do it, does your neighbor has the right to use a gun to your head and force you to give that individual that drop of water that he needs to stay alive? And I think that in general, the goal does not justify the means, and the principle that someone who owns something, property rights, will prevail. Again, whether it is a good thing or a bad thing that you withhold people certain things. They always refer to war situations, which is a very unusual situation. But healthcare is an interesting one, the drugs. Without the healthcare company that makes this one product that can save your life, without that health company, that product would not be there, and you would not have the ability to even buy it or get it, so you would die. So to start with, they were the ones who even made it possible for you to use that drug. They made it, they made all the investments, etc. And it means that it is their privilege, moral privilege also, to decide what to do with that drug. And if they sell it to you at a price that you think it's worth it, then you would buy it probably, and then it would save you. If you think it's not worth your money, then I am not my brother's keeper. If I'm a pharmaceutical company, or if I'm Robert, I do not have a moral obligation to save other people's lives all the time. I mean, that is not my. I mean, if I want to make that my moral obligation, then I can do that on a voluntary basis. But there is no. It's not negative if I'm not doing that. And again, from an economic point of view, it's quite easy to explain that, if you continue to treat the pharmaceutical industry that way and make it basically very difficult, impossible, and almost, make them feel immoral if they don't give stuff away, if they're not, altruistic about it, then you will end up with not having those medications at all. So, I mean, I don't buy that argument at all. Somebody's need in general is not a mortgage on what I am doing, or what I'm producing.
Right. I have a follow-up on the drugs, but let's go to Andy and then I'll come back.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good example, Nikos, that that leftist mentality about medical care, medical services, drugs, and everything, and it represents just a fantastic inversion of a proper morality. I mean, consider just the atrocity here that the leftists are trying to perpetrate. In effect, I'm saying to the pharmaceutical company, or to the MDs, whoever it is, when you're going to save my life, without your services or product, I'm going to die, or my children are going to die. How dare you make money? How dare you make a profit on providing this good or this life-saving good or service? Oh yeah, you spent 20 years of research and development, and God knows how much money, to develop this drug. Or you spent all these years in medical school training for this, and all the money you spent in tuition, and now you have the ability to save my life, and I'm just horrified that you expect me to pay you for it. I mean, it's a vicious absurdity. No matter how much money I pay the doctor or the pharmaceutical company or the biotech guys, no matter how much money I pay them to save my life or my child's life, I get a bargain. I can't give them equal value for what they give me. How much is your life worth? Oh, it's priceless. I can't give them equal value. But as Aristotle says, we give them whatever we can, or give them as much as I can in exchange for saving my life or my wife's life, or my child's life, or whatever. And furthermore, I should not only pay them whatever they want, pay them whatever, they're asking for. And if I can't afford it would be very nice, for rational, honest people to set up medical charities to help pay the price of the medical service or the pharmaceutical. But we should also do this gratefully. We should be grateful to these guys for saving our life, and all I can give you is money. Let me get on my hands and knees. I'm going to pay you for the rest of my life. I'll pay this off thousands and thousands of dollars for the rest of my life. I'll be working to pay you off. But in addition to that, I'm going to get on my knees, and I'm going to be so grateful to you for what you did, because money can't buy. Money's not a sufficient value to pay for what you gave me. I got an enormous bargain for you. Thank you very much. That's one thing. Now you get me? I mean, the leftist mentality just gets me. It makes me see red, if I could play on words. Okay. Now.
But what about the black market during a war or during a calamity situation? So is there something instinctively, wouldn't we say there's something immoral on that?
What is the black market?
So, for example, during an occupation, yeah, you could say the blame stands with the occupier. but the people who make money out of what would say people's misery, wouldn't we say there is something immoral, and even probably from the self-interest point of view? So you make enemies for life, but I don't know. So is it in your self-interest to make loads of money on someone else's misery?
Black market means illicit or illegal profit-driven activities. So, the black market exists to supply demand that's illegal to supply. So, like non-emergency situations, drugs. People want drugs, they're illegal, and so, they're supplied on illegal. Now, if they legalize drugs will be sold by legitimate, honest business people, the same way alcohol is and couldn't be during, U.S. prohibition. Now, the black market in like these totalitarian states is enormously virtuous because it enables people to survive. You can't get food from the government, from the government communes because they don't produce enough food. And there are smugglers then who are criminals in this society, but what they're smuggling in is food. And and they'll sell food, secretly, covertly in their, in some vermin-ridden cellar because you got to hide from the secret police. But it helps if people pay them whatever they can to get, food for their child, and it helps keep people alive. It's enormously virtuous in these kind of dictatorships. It helps keep people alive, and so the smuggler is risking his life making money until the KGB or the Gestapo, catches him. But he's making money by providing an invaluable service. So it's enormously noble and virtuous. The black market is very often highly moral because it's the only thing that keeps people alive in these kind of totalitarian states.
I think, Nikos, there's an element there. There's two things. There's the one thing, as Andy has made very clear, and I think probably most of us will agree, that there's the private, the property rights that you are entitled to, even in a crisis situation, in a war situation. But on a private, personal level, I mean, the example I just made of this guy that needs a drop of water, you can ask the question, how moral is it for me to refuse to give that guy? I mean, he has no right of my water. That is very clear. That is obvious to me, at least. But you can ask yourself the question, what are the circumstances? Is it this guy's own fault, etc., etc.? And you can have a moral decision for yourself on an individual level, whether you think that you want to give this guy water for your reasons that are motivating for you to do. But that's a different situation than or different aspects of it. And people in the war who were really taking big time advantage of people, who needed 2 potatoes to stay in life, as it was in the Netherlands, and were eating flower bulbs and things like that. I don't feel that the people who were really taking advantage of that were morally acting. I mean, they were in their right, but it wasn't something that I would have done, I think.
Yeah, and I think I would draw the line on whether these people were collaborating with the occupier. So if you collaborate with the occupier and that's how you get access to these products, then I think that's definitely immoral and also should be later punished.
In a Nazi-occupied famine, or let's say take the Holodomor as an example. The Ukrainian terror famine, Stalin deliberately imposed in 1932-33 to starve the Ukrainian peasants to death, and millions starved. Nobody even knows how many millions starved. It's one of these little-known atrocities. But supposing somebody risks their life to smuggle in potatoes, or something, and this woman has a few dollars, a few shekels, whatever and her children are starving. The smuggler here could possibly save the life of her child. It's the same principle. There's an enormous value being given. The food is life-saving, and the money in return, no matter how much you could give the smuggler or the black marketer here, it's not enough. I wouldn't say it's not enough. it's not the same value. Money is a high value, but it's not as high a value as saving my child's life.
I don't want to give a spoiler, but in one of Andrew's novels, there is a hero who is doing something similar, smuggling not products, but heroes. But read The Dearth of Eagles for more.
Yeah, well, yeah. Thank you for the plug, Nikos. I appreciate it.
Joseph.
So the question is, so I would argue that it's quite clear how altruism is underlying the accusations of profiteering. And my question is hopefully a little bit more difficult, and that is, what role does epistemology play in the role of accusation of profiteering?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I'm just spitballing here, Joseph, off the top of my head. It's obviously profiteering is a moral, political issue. But epistemology, underlies everything, right? I mean, we know that. But to make that connection I'm just thinking about it. It's certainly not self-evident. But I think the issue here is largely moral. That is, rather than epistemological, and that is, if we understand, as we learned from Ayn Rand, that human life is the standard of moral value, that we see these black market businessmen, or these people who are making a strong profit on goods or services that are scarce and in high demand. They are acting in ways that advance human life. In many cases, they're saving human life. The medications, the medical services, the water, the food that might be smuggled in or brought into an area, of desperate need because high prices can be gained. They are acting in benefit to human life, and consequently, that's what makes these actions virtuous. I think the key principle here is at the what in objectivism they call the meta-ethics, the idea that human life is the standard of moral value. I think that's the salient and dominant principle here. Now, epistemology underlies everything, but off the top of my head, I'm not making the connection, and I think we could if we discuss it long enough. I don't think it's the main issue. I think it's a moral failing on the part of the.
I can take a stab at it. I think underlying is that reason is man's specific means of survival. It's reason that is our way of living. We take things from our environment and produce. So thinking, we have to figure things out. We have to think. What is the enemy of thinking? The enemy of thinking is only one thing, and that's force. That's why, if you translate that into politics, capitalism is the only moral system, because capitalism is the only political system that bans force out of human relationships. That makes that system the only moral system that there is, and that is the justification for profit motive. That is the underlying justification for property rights. So I would make that connection just by taking it one step to where is this whole idea of morality of a system that we call free market, capitalism, etc., is coming from. And it is from the fact that force is the enemy, is anti-life, it's the enemy of our way of survival, our way of living. So that's where that morality is coming from. And the consequence of that is that you are free to have, that you have property rights and are free to do with the things that you have, whatever you want to do. Yeah, that's one angle. The other angle is Andy's angle. It says, it's a very high moral ground to provide these things rather than being punished for it.
Yeah, Robert, that's a really good point. Capitalism is the system of the mind. And notice these, we're talking about shortages of water and shortages of food and, droughts and famines. Notice, there's never, to the best of my knowledge, and I did a lot of research on this when I was writing the Capitalist Manifesto, there's never been a famine in the history of a capitalist country. Because the mind is liberated, and you get people like George Washington Carver, who are pioneers in the field of agricultural science, and you get people like John Deere and Cyrus McCormick, who are pioneers in agricultural technology. And in a free society, in a free market, if there's drought, notice how in Israel, a relatively free society, they're able to irrigate and grow crops in the desert. Similarly, in California, in the Imperial Valley. Capitalism is the system of the mind. It liberates the best thinkers, to solve all these kinds of problems. Just imagine, I'll make one last point on this. Just imagine if we could have the principle of individual rights spread around the world, and free societies proliferate, and free markets proliferate everywhere. 7 billion or 7.5 billion human minds liberated to work on the problems of human survival. Just think how much more advanced we would be in every field: agricultural production, medical science, literature, music, rockets for Elon Musk to get us to Mars. I mean, it's just, the possibilities are endless of an individual rights respecting world.
Amen to that. But the interesting thing is that when you discuss these things about, capitalism, etc., I think there's very few economists who would disagree. I mean, capitalism is seen even by leftist economists as a system that has produced the best results, but they see it as immoral for reasons that we just discussed. But yeah, 7 billion minds liberated. Wow.
Yeah, Julian Simon makes that point in his book, The Ultimate Resource.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and Simon writing in 1980, I think The Ultimate Resource was published in 1980 or 81. I don't know if he'd ever read Atlas Shrugged. He came to a very similar conclusion. He's an American economist, University of Maryland, University of Illinois. And The Ultimate Resource is a really good book. I strongly recommend it because he points out the ultimate resource is not oil or coal or fertile lands. It's this. Yes. It's human intelligence. And this worry about population growth is mythical. It's false, because the more human beings in the world, I mean, assuming you have a free country, the more minds to work on the problems of human survival. So Julian Simon arrived at a conclusion very similar to Ayn Rand, and probably arrived at it independently.
Before I go to the next question to Razi, just a comment on the economists. I think this crisis has shown how shallow is the defense of capitalism addressed precisely solely on economics. Because we see some of the biggest think tanks of liberal think tanks being completely missing from action these days. So they have these timid reports that, maybe, another week of lockdown is going to lead to a 2.5% rise. They should be out on the barricades. They should be out on the barricades and that's why, as I said in the beginning of the record, I'm very proud about the work that objectivist groups like this one is doing. Anyway, because the important thing is to fight this battle when it's difficult, not when it's easy, in salons and with nice cocktails and stuff. It's when these are the times when this battle has to be fought. Anyway, Razi, you have a question.
Andy, you mentioned the inversion of justice in the attacks on pharmaceutical companies, and I want to follow up on that because, there's general, hatred for the wealthy and successful businessmen and so on, but there's something very specific there. Like, you don't see these kinds of attacks on, airlines for selling airplane tickets or hotels or restaurants, luxuries.
Or Apple or Microsoft.
Yeah, but it's very specific. It's as if the more valuable the fruits of your labor, the less of a right you have to them and ultimately to your life. And as you mentioned, this is the ultimate value, which is your life. And somebody who can save it, by being able to save it, basically loses the right to theirs. So I wanted to basically ask you guys what that means for our culture and the dominant philosophy in the culture, and if you have any advice on how to fix it.
The culture is obviously very mixed. It's not all bad. There's still a lot of good, in Western culture. And I live in the United States, which, I think although we're moving towards a Bernie Sanders, mentality, there's still a lot of respect for individual rights and capitalism from a lot of people. And there's still a lot of people who don't hate the rich, so there's a lot of admiration for entrepreneurs, at Apple, Microsoft, SpaceX, all kinds of companies like that. But the anti-pharmaceutical company mentality is widespread, and it's disturbing. I mean, you're absolutely right, Razi. In return for saving somebody's life, you lose your freedom. You're now a slave. That's really and it's profoundly disturbing. I think there's an obvious. Somebody was said it before, Joseph maybe. There's an obvious altruistic principle here that you have to sacrifice in order to save my life. It's that's deeply entrenched in a lot of people's minds. Goes back to religion, right? Christianity and Judaism. So that altruist mentality is still deeply entrenched. It rears its ugly head. You see that Western civilization is this mixed case. There is this altruist mentality that rears its ugly head, and particularly vicious iterations like the one you're talking about, Razi. And then side by side with it, there's a lot of respect for egoism and the idea that you should pursue your own happiness. You see it come up all the time. The healthy part of the culture. Somebody's in a bad marriage, and then their friends will tell them, or their family members will tell them, look, you have the right to be happy. If you want to get a divorce, even if it really hurts your husband or wife, emotionally, if you want to get a divorce, you have the right to be happy. You'll see that, all the time. That's a good, healthy, egoism. But the example you're bringing up is particularly vicious. It's riddled with envy. That somebody could be so successful. But it's I think the key principle here, as I see it, is altruism. That the more the higher the value that I stand to lose, the more your freedom is endangered. There's this invert. The higher the value I stand to lose, the more we're gonna the more we have the right to enslave you. It's a vicious inversion. What's the antidote to it? Well, thank God for Ayn Rand. What you guys are doing. What the antidote to it is to try to get people to read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and discuss a proper egoism, and that human life is the standard of value. That if somebody's benefiting human life, they're doing good and should be rewarded. And like Robert said before, the mind is mankind's means of survival. The mind requires freedom. We need to celebrate the creative mind. We need to celebrate freedom. We need to celebrate people who provide life-giving services. I think that's the antidote. Thank God Ayn Rand gave it to us, and gave it to us in the form of the 2 greatest novels ever written. And now all we have to do is get people to read it. Now, in the United States, that's really hard because so many people can't read anymore. But that's another story for another day.
It's certainly altruism, collectivism, and a kind of utilitarianism as well, in the sense that, your life is so important that we can force other people to save your life. And, they are immoral if they don't sacrifice something that is relatively small for them for something that's so big for somebody else. It's a complete, you're right, this complete inversion of morality.
It's very interesting, the utilitarian issue, because we hear all the time, even by good people in this crisis. So people who are against, or not, who are skeptical of this whole lockdown narrative. So they say, okay, how many people losing their jobs is good, is worth it in terms of how many people die? And this is the mentality of the central planner, who has absolute power and needs to make the decision, these people versus these people. Whereas the obvious option is, what is your response? What is the risk that you are ready to take? and what is your responsibility in all this, to protect yourself, to protect others. But here's the question though, since the government has already got a big role in the economy, and this cannot change from now till tomorrow. I mean, even if Andy became the prime minister, he wouldn't cut the welfare state in an evening, okay? So taking this into accordance, couldn't we say that the government could, for example, buy in stock billions and billions of vaccines and give it to the population for free? Could we cut them some slack in terms of, well, it's a public health system, therefore, for this crisis, and since they're already really involved in healthcare, by the way, give me the vaccine for free?
The thing there is, yes, the government is already very deep in healthcare, and that is a given. You know, somebody used the example of, you know, there's this bus getting off the road, and, you know, you can start arguing whether the driver should have been not a collectivist driver, but something else. You know, you're now in a situation that the bus is getting off the road, and you have to find solutions. So the government, you know, what they should have done, I think, and what they can still do, is have a focus on the individual and have a focus not on a whole collective or utilitarian approach, but they should very simply focus on the people that have the virus and as a consequence are a danger to others. Just as they do with guns, when people are roaming around with a gun, threatening people. The task of government, and I think that is widely accepted, certainly in the US more than probably in Europe, that the task of the government is to protect the lives and the rights of the individual. So the proper approach to this whole thing could have been and should have been on developing tests, for instance. And the government, being in the healthcare, they should have offered to pay these things and give a huge price on them so that the profit motive would have, you know, continued to work so that tests would be developed. They get the government out of the way in terms of allowing certain tests or not allowing certain tests. The focus should have been on finding out who is a danger to other people. When you are a danger to other people, the government has the perfect right to quarantine them and put them aside. That's one thing. The second thing they should have done, again, aimed at the individual, is leaving people free if they are not a danger to others, leaving people free to continue with their life. And if, as they have said, which is a valid reason, to avoid the overloading of the ICs and the hospitals, there are different solutions to just closing down everything. It's first of all, we by now know what kind of people end up in the IC. You know, it's age related to a large extent. It has some underlying other things. So there should be a focus to make sure that those people do not get the virus, because then you overload the system. And there are things that can be, if it would have been focused on the individual rather than we are all in this together. That is the thing. What I liked very much as an aside of Onkar Gatte's approach is he compared it also to what's happening in Sweden, for instance. If in terms of preparation for the next one, you could codify in the law what government, when there is a pandemic, and what kind of measures for how serious it is, you can define what the government can and cannot do. It could be in the constitution even. In Sweden, there's no lockdown because it's in the constitution that they cannot have a lockdown. The government simply cannot do it. So they don't even talk about it because they can't do it. So the focus is on other things. So once the government, and yes, the government is in the healthcare system, they screw up things, yeah, then it makes sense for them to pay for solving certain things. It's not, they shouldn't be in the healthcare system, but they are. So, you know, we have to deal with that.
Okay, so let's go to the question by Ella. So what do you think of the mental distress caused by the inability to afford some essential goods in capitalism? And as a side question, there are many extreme cases of this, which result in trauma, i.e. the loss of loved ones when they can't afford healthcare. Is there any way to mitigate this?
Yeah, I was just looking at that.
And there are many examples in the States with people having to do an expensive treatment and then the insurance company saying basically no. Now, I don't know how anecdotal they are, but there are indeed cases. So why don't we deal with it in two ways? A, the stress, the distress of trying to, of kind of running a race to afford the basic stuff, and what when you can't afford something which could be necessary for your life?
Let me answer this, because there's two things that I wanted to say on this. And that is, one, I think we can and should set up all kinds of medical charities for people who can't afford, a good health care. And I think in the free countries, you see an enormous amount of philanthropy and charity. I forget the numbers. We could research it. But in the United States, every year there are billions of dollars, given away in philanthropy. Some for medical causes, some for educational causes, some for Habitat for Humanity that builds homes, some for the Red Cross, and so on and so forth. I think we could do more with that regarding medical charities. But I think the key point here is not to judge these issues out of context. When we put it to full context, there's an enormous amount of evidence to support the claim that the best medical care in the world is in the United States. When they survey physicians around the world, it's always, by far the best medical care is in the United States. Part of the evidence is how many more people survive different types of cancer, how many more people can survive heart disease, and so on and so on. In these socialized medicine countries where they can't afford to train oncologists or cardiologists, they set up charities to send people to the United States to get care, but rather than wait for 2 years on a waiting list, in Canada or England or Sweden. The problem with medical care in the United States is it's expensive. Now, we need, why? We need to know why, so we can address the root fundamentally. The United States is a mixed economy, just like Sweden, England. There's this widespread misconception people have all over the world that the United States is essentially capitalist, and Sweden is essentially socialist, right? That's a widespread mentality, and they're wrong in both cases. Both those systems are mixed systems. They're both mixed economies. Sweden may be a little bit more socialist and less capitalist than the United States. The United States may be a little bit more capitalist and less socialist. But it's not by much. The United States hasn't been an essentially capitalist system for 100 years now, since the progressive era. The point is, medical care in the United States is part of the mixed economy. It's part capitalist and part socialist. It's part free market and it's part government control. What accounts for the very high quality of medical care in the United States? It's the free market capitalist element. What accounts for the very high cost of medical care? It's the socialist element. How? Well, how much of American medical care is now paid by third-party payers? It's not just Medicare and Medicaid. It's the way government tax incentives have ensured that in many cases employers pay for their employees' medical care. There's tens and tens and tens of millions of Americans who don't pay for their own medical care, or who just pay a very small deductible. It's interesting that prior to World War II, when the United States was a free market in medicine, the cost of medical care was unbelievably low. Guys, I'm old enough to still remember when doctors made house calls. When I was a kid, doctors still made house calls, and they charged like $3 or $5 a visit. This was in the 1960s, before medical care became provided overwhelmingly by third-party payers. You can look at the numbers. Milton Friedman's written on this. A number of economists have written on this. The cost of medical care in the United States pre-World War II and post-World War II is just astronomically different. The point here is private medical care on a fully free market is enormously inexpensive. It's when you're paying for your own medical care, when you're paying for your own medical care, let's put it that way, the price the demand, it diminishes significantly, and consequently the price diminishes significantly. I'm not an economist. You know, Robert said before, this is Econ 101. When other people are paying for this good or service for you, it's much easier to spend other people's money. This is what third-party payers is what mandated by various government policies is what accounts for the enormously expensive cost of medical care in the United States. We need to get back to a free market in medicine. That'll bring the cost of medical care back down dramatically to where it was prior to this partial socialization of the medical industry.
And taking away my hat of the devil's advocate. So I mentioned black markets earlier. So in Greece, you can easily visit a very good private doctor, or have him visit you at home if you're very sick, for something like 50 euros. And of course, it's part of the quote black market, which is actually the free market. And please don't ever believe for a minute that the Greece is in crisis because we don't pay our taxes. Actually, what saved Greece from the crisis is this underground economy where free individuals were made their own arrangements outside of the radar of the state. And this is why even, I think in this crisis, Greece is going to do better than countries like the UK, where everything is expected by the state. So sorry for this interjection.
In Europe, certainly in Holland and in the UK and many European countries, Medicare is socialized. It's a very social system in Holland, and it's very difficult for people to see the overall effect. If they only look at the price that the individual pays for his medical care, it is actually not very high. But if you look at the total cost of the total system, which is being paid by those same people through their taxes, it is very very high. It's inefficient, and also it has screwed up completely the insurance systems. You cannot insure anymore what you want to insure yourself against. There's a uniform policy which covers everything, and everybody has to pay exactly the same kind of money. It's the whole system is really screwed up in that respect. But about the distress and about the fact that if you do not get, and to get back to the question, if you do not get the medical care that you need, I mean, that is important to you to survive or whatever, that is a real that is a real thing. If you cannot get medication and you are very sick, that will cause trauma, but that is not. And if you want to, you can do something about it yourself through charities, through setting up charities, things like that. But the fact that people get traumatized by something is not a reason to throw away individual rights as a consequence. So it is true probably that it happens, and it causes distress. But maybe it causes distress for a lot of things if you don't have them. Before we live, this time and age that we live now, we are so much better off than we were 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago. I mean, those people that can have now access to medical means, to medical care, they would have died anyway. I mean, 50 to 100 years ago. So it's, yes, it will be stress, but it's not that if there is stress, you suddenly have the right to something that somebody else owns.
Good point, Robert. I want to go back to the economics for a second. I mean, everybody knows who Milton Friedman was, right? I mean, Nobel Prize winning economist. And Friedman made a good point on this. He said, what was his exact quote? As price approaches zero, demand approaches infinity. I mean, that's a nice formulation. As price approaches zero, demand approaches infinity. And we see the consequences with the free on-demand medical care, in various European countries. Yeah, bringing their child in for a sore throat won't have to pay much. But the tax money, necessary to finance this system, inevitably, in all cases, breaks the budget, the government's budget.
Yes.
So they have to cut costs. So what they do, and I've done a fair amount of reading in this, generally they train, from what I can make out in England, Canada, Holland, and places, Germany, they do a good job training general practitioners, and if you need medical services that a GP can provide, they do a good job with that. But specialists need more training, and it costs more money, and they don't have the budget for it, and so they have to skimp on specialists. And so there are fewer oncologists than there would be in a free market of medicine. There are fewer cardiologists than there would be in a free market of medicine. And consequently, the waiting list for people suffering from these serious maladies, grows long. And God knows how many people die waiting to see a cardiologist or an oncologist for these serious diseases that might well have been treatable. And that's why I remember Heartbeat Windsor in Canada was a private charity organization that raised money. Heartbeat. It was for heart patients who couldn't get in to see a cardiologist in Canada, and so they raised money by private charity to send them to the United States to see an American cardiologist. People die because of free on demand, and thousands of them from serious ailments, but ones that were treatable.
Amy makes the point in the chat that actually what public health does is it is rationing the services, and this became very clear these days with the crisis, where basically the NHS was telling you, don't come to us. And I know people so this is not, it is anecdotal, but also it's not anecdotal. People with serious conditions that they could not continue their treatment, or who had important tests in front of them and they couldn't do them. And now they're making a U-turn on that, and they're trying to persuade people that, look, if you want something, you can go. Or the issue with the NHS is doing adverts on YouTube trying to tell you how to protect your teeth, because if you want to go to the dentist, now this is not a good time. And I think that explains that tells you all you need to know about, quote, free healthcare. So Ella says thanks about your point. So I'll ask, since we haven't got any other question, I will ask a last question, which is also kind of parting word. So Robert, with your economic expertise, and Andy, with your experience of, capitalism, what is and what is not capitalism, and in what kind of economy we live. What is your prediction about the future in terms of where the world is going, and also where the economy is going? Not where it should be going. I think we have established that, but where it is actually going.
Obviously, for everybody, that's a very difficult question. But what I've seen through the years, and now with the crisis, I think the crisis is certainly not helping. It will be a setback in thinking. Before the crisis, I had the idea that if you looked at the economy in a number of countries, there seemed to be a move towards some more freedom, some more, what happened in Hong Kong, for instance, was a very good sign to the world to show that what China was trying to do was not such a good idea, so that helped. But overall, you have to be optimistic, but I'm not so sure how optimistic I am for the long term. There will be a point. Actually, what you see in these mixed economy systems is that they do not go completely down. I mean, they find a balance between having a reasonably good life with a reasonable amount of with a certain amount of government force and government direction. And people like in Holland, I think 80% of people, if you ask them, would say that they are probably they're happy. They are they don't die. They're happy. Of course, what they don't see is all the missed stuff that what would have been if it was a free economy. But I cannot answer your question on where it will go. I'm not so optimistic it will go into the right direction. And certainly now with this crisis, I think it will be a dent in the development. And as an individual, all you can do is keep on the good work and try to convince people that things should be done differently. But it's what can you do? I mean, Ayn Rand had a very good piece on what can you do as an individual, and that's what I'm trying to do. But I'm not that optimistic. Don't know about you, Andy.
Do you think also that, because you mentioned that usually mixed economies somehow push the ball further down the road, are you afraid that this could be, in economic terms, like a big crisis, like 29 and even worse?
You mean this one now?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think that this one will be a look at the US. There's 36 million people already now unemployed. I mean, it is in Holland. Clearly the number of people hit is horrendous, and the amount of money they've thrown money in the US as well, but in Holland as well, billions and billions of euros being thrown as help packages. And somebody has to pay for that, so it will slow down the economy. It will slow down development of just about everything. No, this is if that was your question, there's no doubt people still underestimate the effects of the damage that has been done and is still being done to the economy and to individual lives and to individual dreams of people. To everything human flourishing will get a big dent.
Andy,
we have. See, I'm much more familiar with what's going on in the United States than in anywhere else around the world. We have an enormously important election coming up in November. I think prior to the pandemic, I think Trump, who's a very mixed case, had done some good things in his economic policies, and I think the economy was doing well, largely because of Trump. Whereas I think the Democrats are. I think the party has just lost its mind, and they're viciously insane, moving more and more towards socialism. The fact that Bernie Sanders could even be considered, as a serious candidate tells me where that party is. That's why I think it's vitally important that Trump wins re-election, that the Republicans maintain control of the U.S. Senate, hopefully win back control of the House, which is very possible. I see a lot of dissatisfaction with the Democrats in the United States, and Joe Biden, the poor guy. Look, I don't want to, Razi, I asked Razi twice what the topic was, that was going to be profiteering. I kept forgetting, and I was going to ask Razi a third time and say, I want to sound like Joe Biden, here, but I don't want, want to make fun of some poor guy who might be suffering from senility or, encroaching senility. It's not fun. My father died of Alzheimer's. I saw what it's like. It's horrible. It looks like poor Joe Biden. I don't like Biden, but I don't want to see the guy, suffer from this ailment either. But if he's the Democratic candidate and he's suffering from senility, I feel for the guy. I do. But he's not going to win. He's not going to win the election. Anyhow, I think the United States, if the Republicans, do well in the upcoming election, I think the United States can pull out of the severe recession or even depression within 4 years of Trump's second term if he wins. Nevertheless, I think, or at least beyond the road to recovery, I think. But short term, 4 years, 10 years, 20 years, I'm not optimistic. The direction, there's still a lot of good things in American culture. You see all these different companies. I love Elon Musk, as much of a mixed case as he is, rent-seeker extraordinaire. But I love SpaceX, and we're going to be landing on Mars in 30 years, and human beings are going to be an interplanetary species. I love the visionary aspect of that. And there are companies like that in the United States, and there's a lot of good things, in the culture. Politically economically, I think we're moving towards dictatorship. I don't know if it can be stopped. Now, long term, I'm much more optimistic. Maybe not in America, but at Ayn Rand's ideas, her books are translated into every language. Educated people all over the world read English. They can read Ayn Rand in the original. Long term, I think Ayn Rand's ideas are going to catch on. somewhere. There'll be a renaissance. Here's my fear for the short term. If the United States starts to go down the tubes, economically, and we don't have, we move towards socialism, we don't have the wealth, to put into our military. What is the bulwark for free countries around the world against the communist regime in China? What's the bulwark against Putin? What's the bulwark against jihadists and/or even the North Korean regime? It's the U.S. military, especially the U.S. Navy, which is freaking invincible. And nobody wants to tangle with these guys. They got nuclear submarines in every deep underwater, in every ocean in the world that can hammer you with Trident missiles, with nuclear warheads. Nobody wants to attack America because, or America's allies, because of the overwhelming, military response and retaliation. What happens if we don't have the economic power to continue to develop and deploy that kind of military, and/or as we move towards socialism, lose the moral will to use it? I mean, if you have perpetual Obama as president or Bernie Sanders as president, it doesn't even matter if you have the power. You won't have the will to use it. My fear is, as the United States is going to move more and more into socialism, and militarily, that's going to embolden the communist regime in China, Putin, jihadists, the North Korean regime. There are some bad guys out there, and we take for granted that they're under control to a significant degree, largely because of the power of the U.S. military and the U.S. Navy. If we lose the power or the will to deploy that power, then I think short term, in the short term, in the next 50 years, we're going to see war and the emboldening of really bad guys to attack the free countries in the world. And I'm afraid that's the direction we're moving. 500 years from now, I think Ayn Rand's ideas will have caught on somewhere, and you'll see a renaissance. Short term, though, like next 50 years, I hate to say this, but I be as realistic as I can. I think the outlook is bleak.
Well, one of the reasons, Andy, that I'm pessimistic for the future is the complete lack of thinking in principles on the right side of the spectrum in the US. If I look at the Grand Old Party, to the Republicans, I don't see anybody anymore who's saying anything, that makes sense. A little bit on the economy, yes, but it's on, I find the fact that my country, at least in terms of, ideals, founding fathers, this whole body of ideas, the only country ever founded on a philosophy, fantastic, and all that it is producing today is a choice between Biden and Trump, or before Clinton and Trump. I mean, if that is what the freest and the best country in the world can still produce, then I'm pessimistic. And I had hoped actually that over the last, basically after Obama won, I had hoped that on the Republican side there was going to be some sort of a renaissance in terms of thinking in principles, but it has become even more pragmatic and very little defense on both. That I find Trump he has no depth, he has no principle, he has very little of anything. Yeah, he's done some economic, but what he's done with this protectionism and this whole, anti-free trade is really damaging the economy big time as well. So I'm not, if I look at the whole spectrum, I'm optimistic about individual Americans, but I'm not that optimistic about the politicians anymore.
Even regarding to the virus, you could say in the beginning his heart was in the right place. At least, he was trying to be optimistic. But then when I saw him 2 weeks ago attacking Sweden for Sweden not going into lockdown, I realized this guy is such a whim worshipper that there's little hope.
No idea.
I get what Andy's saying, although I completely disagree on his take on what should be kind of the role of the U.S. military, but that's another issue. But anyway, that's for another discussion. But thank you so much both for bringing your good ideas and your expertise. Razi, do you want to say the parting words?
Well, I just want to say on Robert's last point, yeah, I also, after Obama was elected, I thought, if America can survive him, at least then the Republicans will be more pro-free market. And the Tea Party movement looked like that might be where they're headed. But of course, what the Tea Party lacked was principles. And then the Republicans ended up going with, I think, the only person who could give Obama a run for his money as worst president ever. So yeah, I'm not that optimistic about the U.S. either, but I am optimistic about the U.K. Not because of what's going on in politics, but because of what we're doing. So I encourage everybody here to attend our events and invite people to our events. And if you're able to do so, even at this time, join the membership program and support us that way as well. Thank you to both our speakers, and thank you to Nikos for chairing. Our next event is on Wednesday. I know I advertised today late. I can't guarantee that I'm not going to advertise Wednesdays late, but Wednesday will be also at 7 until 9. The topic of that is the third installment in our What's Next series, and this is What's Next for Conservatives. So that'll be sort of on the topic that we discussed here at the end. So thanks again, everybody, and see you Wednesday.